Hello. In the previous videos, we have discussed the philosophy of Maarg. We have discussed the elements and how to use the platform. In this video, let us try to go through some demo Maargs and understand how to use the platform better. So I'm currently logged in as a user Deepak. And if I'm new to the platform, most likely an author has recommended me this platform, in which case I know the username. Or if you do not know any user so far, you can always start by searching Maarg app, and this one will have, once you search, you can see some demo Maargs. So let us try to start with something simple. So this Maarg tries to address whether souls exist. Now, there are two possible answers to that question, yes or no. So in a traditional debate format, we will be trying to compare these two outcomes based on certain factors. So the author of this Maarg, which is the Maarg app, the author has tried to explain the meaning of each of these factors. And as we can see here, the context tries to explain each of these factors in detail. So how do we compare? Like in a conventional debate, we usually get two sides and each side present their arguments. And to those arguments, there are counter arguments. And that's how we get the ball rolling. But on Maarg, we take a different approach. We try to figure out what are some factors that should be kept in mind while answering the question. So, for example, in here, the outcome yes or no is evaluated on the scientific evidence. Which side, what does modern science take? What does modern science talk about each of these outcomes? Then, how about public experiences? Have what do general public talk about? What should be the outcome? Then there is a religious view, and also a personal observation. So, for example, if you already have experienced something like soul, you may not even care about the other three factors. Now we'll talk about how to, so because each of the factors have a different weightage in general, you may be a completely pro-science person and you may not even care about these three other factors. Okay, so before we proceed, there is also an option to check the definitions. For example, what is soul? Before we start debating about soul, it's important that we all agree, at least for the sake of a discussion, what is soul or what is a non-physical entity. And finally, we can also look at the argument depth. So this is a very simple Maarg. As you can see, this barely has any inferences or observations or anything. So if this overview looks good, what we can do is move to the Explore tab and start a new session, which is a guided reading session. So once we start this, as you can see, we are now in a guided tour or a guided view. The advantage of a reading session is basically if we exit, or let us say we lose internet connection, everything over here is actually saved. So this is very helpful if we have longer Maargs and more complex Maargs to read. So if we resume, we again have the definitions and the context that we discussed before. Let's move on. So for Maarg, what we try to do is, first of all, try to understand the relevance of each factor for yourself. So, for example, as I said, you may be a pro-science guy, but not like to 100%. So you can say that this is an important factor, but not extremely important. Public experiences. What do people think about the existence of soul? Does that matter to you? If someone comes to you and says if they have personally experienced soul, will that impact your decision? Let us say um, uh, somewhat important. A religious view may be somewhat important, and then personal observation. If you yourself have ever experienced soul, that may supersede everything. So these are random numbers, of course. These are not something that I'm promoting. These are purely random for demonstration numbers. If we save this, let's move on to the next section. So we come to the pre-evaluation section. The reason why we have pre-evaluation is because as a reader, when I read a book or an article, or let's say we watch a TV debate, The goal when we are reading or listening to something is we want to change our opinions, and we need to measure what were our opinions before we read that and after we read that. So it is important for that measurement to happen. We need to capture the your opinion before you read the argument, and then we'll do this same step again after you read the arguments. So as you can see, there are two outcomes and all the factors that we discussed before. The first outcome is about no, the souls do not exist. Now we need to score each of these factors on this rating scale. So as of now, this everything is neutral, but we can change this to terrible, or we can make this excellent. When we move this up to excellent, it means that there is a lot of scientific evidence that says souls do not exist. And if we move this to terrible, it means that there is almost no scientific evidence that says souls do not exist. Similarly, on the yes scale, which says souls do exist, we can say there is a lot of scientific evidence that says souls exist. Or when we say this is terrible, it means that there is almost no scientific evidence that souls exist. Now, these may look quite similar, but again, you have to remember we are rating each outcome on the merits of that outcome itself. We are not actually comparing the two sides as we do in a conventional debate, because it's easy to get lost in comparison. But it's much easier if we talk about the merits of each outcome separately, and then in the end, we try to compare and make a decision out of that. So let us try to score these outcomes. We will try to give a score on each of these factors. Before we do that, please note that everything I say or I have written are not my personal opinions. They are purely for the demonstration, and they are hypothetical in nature. So let's say scientific evidence that says souls do not exist. Um, let's keep this low because I'm not sure if there are any scientific articles that conclusively say that souls do not exist. Public experiences, people saying for sure that souls do not exist. Let's say not many. Most people seem to believe. Religious view on the top of which that says souls definitely do not exist. There are some that say so. Personal observation, which means whether I personally think whether souls do not exist. Let's say I'm neutral on that so far. This again, when you are doing these, when you are reading, doing a reading session, you will obviously have a different set of scoring for this. On the other outcome, which means souls do exist, the scientific evidence that says souls do not exist, again, almost, the scientific evidence that says souls do exist is again fairly low, let's say terrible. Um, Public experiences which says that souls exist. There have been some incidents. Then religious view, most religions seems to say yes. Personal observation, again, let's say I'm neutral, or let's say I'm somewhat positive here. So once we have done this score and we save, once we move to the next section, the pre-evaluation section would be closed, and then we will talk about the other sections. Now we are on the evaluation section. If you can see over here, we can jump to previous sections. For example, we can always go back to summary whenever we have a doubt. We can also go to decision factors to review our previous inputs, and we can always change them. This example, as you can see, the pre-evaluation section is now closed. We cannot edit. This example is fairly simplistic, so there are no inferences or cones yet. We'll discuss that shortly after. And finally, we are in the post-evaluation section, which means that each evaluation now, this is the time we will get to see how the author has argued for each. So for example, right now we are looking at the evaluation E1, which is no, souls do not exist. Now over here, each of the four factors have been, there are certain reasonings that the author has tried to write about. And again, you may or may not agree with these arguments, but this is what the author thinks. So scientists have not found any empirical evidence of soul. So you can agree or disagree, and based on that, you can always change uh, these ratings or these scores for that factor. So let's say I now want to say that there is enough scientific evidence that says no, souls do not exist. Similarly, once you read other arguments, you can again change these numbers um, arbitrarily, and that's it. We can save this, move on to the next one, which is souls do exist, and again you will get a new set of reasoning over here. And for each, after reading the reasoning, you can again try to rate this in a different direction, or you can stay neutral, for example. Once we save this, we can again move on to the next section. So now we have completed all the sections, and this is the point where we can now generate the learning report. So I'm gonna press submit. This takes us back to the summary section. We can explore the Maarg again, or we can load the published Maarg, as you can see over here. Again, if you can notice over here, the older draft, which we just did, you can always resume that session, which means you can sort of go ahead and change everything over here, or your ratings, and then resubmit and generate a new learning report. For now, what we can do is delete that draft because the job is done. So this loads the session that we just did, and out here you can again check everything, all the details of the Maarg, your inputs as well. If we move to the result tab, this is where the crux of our learning is present. So we can see our before and after responses. As you can see, uh, some of our opinions have changed, in some cases considerably, and in some cases not so much. And then for both the outcomes, we can see how much our opinions have changed on each factor. But why are these opinions, I mean, why do they even matter? The reason why they matter is because ultimately our decision or the conclusion of whether or not souls exist is based on the scores on each of these factors. So as you can see here in the scores and ranking section, so if you look at the decision here, you can see our decision has not changed. In this case, since I was the reader, my decision has not changed. So E1 or E2. E2 is saying yes, souls do exist. So you can see that previously, before I read the Maarg, this was my choice. This was my decision or my conclusion that souls do exist. But I was not so sure. As in, you can see the score is minimal. It's 0.08, which is fairly close to 0, which means I was neutral. Had this score been high, like 3, that would mean that I really believed in souls before I started reading. After I read through the Maarg, as you can see, the score changed somewhat. Not by a lot, but somewhat. So from 0.08, it moved to 0.33. And therefore, it is still the highest factor. Among the two outcomes, the score of E2 is higher than that of E1, which is over here, the second option. In this case, you can also see that the score of no souls do not exist. Previously, this was minus 0.58, which means that I sort of strongly disagreed, but that score has somewhat improved, which means the overall Maarg, once I read through the arguments, both my outcomes, they have somewhat changed towards the positive side. Although the overall decision it has not changed, but my opinion about both these have somewhat changed in the positive direction. And again, going by these the numbers, the reason why uh, this platform may even sound complicated is because we are talking numbers, but ultimately these numbers are present so that you can get a very precise measurement of how much your opinion is changing, because in real life we do not actually change our opinions just by reading one argument. Like, we cannot drastically change our opinion in just one argument. Our opinions generally change over time, little by little, and this is why these numbers are important. So that's the scores and ranking part. We can also see our learnings. So again, these are calculated based on the overall rating scores that you have given. And as you can see, as a reader, I cannot really see what the Maarg author was promoting. These scores and ranks do not really say what is the author's viewpoint. All I can see is the author's thought process, and based on that I come to my own conclusion. And over here, because there were only two arguments, it looks like we can infer that the author was also, we do not have an overlap, so you can sort of gather what was author's opinion or what was the author's conclusion. But over here you can see, based on these scores, how much the author was able to persuade you in order to change your opinion in their favor. Uh, by that we mean how much of these scorings are close to that of the author. And that is precisely what this learning report is about, because ultimately what the author wants to do is um, share certain arguments that makes you change these scores of each of these factors similar to what they have. And that is the goal of perhaps any writer or anyone who is debating. In addition to the learning report, you always have access to the entire argument map. This was a fairly simple mark, so there is actually nothing over here once you click. And the reason for that is because when the author has written an evaluation where the conclusion has been written without using any inferences or observations. So you may recall, observations are data points and inferences are reasonings. The reason why an author might want to use inferences on observations is because, as of now, the reasoning or the conclusion that has been written about both the sides of the argument, as you can see, if there is any sort of disagreement, so let us say this first point which says scientists have not found any empirical evidence of soul, you may disagree with this, right? Now, how do you give, as a reader, how do I give a feedback to the author? And if this particular thing, if this is a data point, this could have been put in an observation. And so for multiple readers, they can collaboratively rate each of the inferences arguments. And so that would give a much more granular control to the author in order to change their argument if their inferences are incorrect. That means their logic is somewhat convoluted and they might want to change that. And then there is observation, which means the data itself that they're using is incorrect. And if the readers point that out, it's much easier for the author to change their argument. This helps the author tremendously, because the authors can now, obviously, whenever they are writing, they are sharing a thought process. When readers give that feedback, it is much easier for the authors to change their argument, or at least change their inference and observation to convince the readers in a better way. This also has some advantages for the readers. So first of all, as a reader, you may have noticed sometimes we have dual standards on the same data point. If we use in one argument, we agree with that, and then we disagree with that when it's a different argument. If we are able to split this up into observations and inferences, and then use those inferences and observation across two different outcomes, it makes it much more easier for us to track our own understanding. It sort of exposes our own double standards sometimes. In order to see this in action, I think we should try a different mark. So let us try a little more complex one. So for example, the second one says criteria for voter eligibility of American citizens in the US presidential elections. So this mark, it looks like there are four outcomes. So for example, what should be the criteria of voter eligibility? This was recently brought by some of the US presidential candidates who have been talking about changing the voter age. So the first outcome here is change the voter age to 25 plus. There is another side of argument that says decrease the voter age to 16 plus. Then there is one more side that says there has to be certain sense of civic duty that people should do in order to gain the voting privilege. And then fourth option is continue with the voter age of 18, that is the current state. Now, you may have noticed the previous argument, the previous Maarg that we read had only two outcomes, yes or no, whether souls exist or they do not exist. Now, this is a call of the author, how they want to structure their Maarg, what are the outcomes they want to talk about. And then there are also the decision factors that go, how they compare, that is up to the Maarg author to decide. So if we want to see the context over here, in the context, each of these decision factors are discussed in detail. So for example, if we are talking about who should be able to vote, then whatever outcome that we do should be able to test voters' cognitive health. That can be one factor. The other factor can be whether that outcome tests for voters' social awareness, then whether that outcome promotes diverse participation across all age groups or all groups of the society, then whether that outcome adheres to global conventions, and whether it contributes to nation building. Now again, all these factors, you may agree or disagree with these. Some factors may be very important to you, and some factors may not be at all important. So that is left up to the reader. The job of the Maarg author is to just document all sort of factors and all sort of outcomes, and then try to argue on each outcome based on each factor, and then the readers make their own decision. So this is the context, and definitions again are fairly important here, because anything that we talk in terms of voting and elections, different people may have different types of understanding of what is the eligibility, what do we mean by eligibility, what do we mean by direct democracy, and what do we mean by proof of responsibility. So again, this is a job of the Maarg author to document as much as possible. And as a reader, when you come across a Maarg, you can always go through these definitions and context and factors to see if this Maarg is well researched or not. Finally, you can always look at the argument depth. Compared to the previous one where we did not have any inferences, any observations at all, this one has multiple inferences and observations, and that is why the reading time is also has increased. So as before, we can click on Explore Maarg, and so currently I have not done any session on this, otherwise you would have seen the multiple sessions that we do. If we start a new session, this creates a new draft which we can exit, and then once we come back to explored section, we can always resume this later. So this kind of helps if you want to read the Maarg offline. Now we have started the reading session. We can always review the definitions and the context anytime we want. We can then proceed. This is again, we are trying to rate each of these decision factors. For example, the voter's cognitive health may be an extremely important criteria in order to decide the voting age. The voter's social awareness may also be extremely important, let's say somewhat important, and then we whether or not the age criteria, does it promote diverse participation? Let's say I don't care, so this is not important to me at all. And then adheres to global conventions, let us say we want, this also doesn't even matter. And finally contributes to nation building, let's say this has to be high. Now, once we do the decision factors, we can always revisit and change this. For now, we save and move on to next. So again, now we are back to the pre-evaluation section over here. This is something that if you are not sure about any factors, you can always leave this neutral. But for now, let's say I change a little bit. So these are just random values, and we move on to next. So do notice that you can always go back to previous section and then move around. But this brings us to after decision factors, we are now talking about inferences. So the way this works is because the author, Maarg author, has split up their argument in form of inferences and observations. As a reader, I will first go through all the inferences without even knowing how that actually contributes to the outcome. But after I agree or disagree with each outcome, that is when I get to re-evaluate each of the outcome. So let's start with this one. The first inference itself does not rely on other inferences, but the reasoning says that 16-year-olds are legally allowed to drive and marry, which indicates a social acceptance of their cognitive brain functions and long-term decision-making skills. Now, you may agree or disagree. Let's say the reasoning, I'm not convinced that 16-year-old adults are mature enough to participate in social activities. Let's say, even after the reasoning, let's say I disagree, and we move on. So the next one, so the previous inference over here did not use any inferences and observations, which means that these are purely my opinion. But in the next section, we can see that this inference, that decision quality of 16-year-olds is as good as 18 years old. This is something which is backed by an observation which has a citation, which means you can click on this link to read more about this research. And then from that source, we have a citation, which you can read that the quality of citizens' choices is similar to that of older voters. As a reader, I also get to choose, maybe I do not trust this source, which is a possibility. For example, I may have used a citation source that is somewhat a fake news. That is a possibility. And what if from this article I have misquoted something or taken something out of context? Now, each time you select these options, this kind of gives a feedback to the Maarg author, because then that gives them a chance to change their argument. They can actually go find a different source of that information. They can reword the quote or something like that. But as you can see, the advantages of splitting their arguments between observations and inferences is that your feedback is much more granular than the previous approaches. So let us say, despite disagreeing with the observation, I still agree with the observation itself. Whether in countries where 16-year-olds are allowed to vote, their voting decisions are as good. So even despite disagreeing with the citation, I agree with the observation, let's say. And finally, we have presented the inference reasoning based on what we saw here. In countries where 16-year-olds are allowed to vote, their style is similar to 18 years old. Let's say I agree with this, and we move on. After this, we have presented the next inference. Over here, we can go through this again, but let's say for now, this inference is actually using multiple observations. Um, I'm just going to put some random number values over here. And finally, inference reasoning. So this reasoning is where you get to analyze, depending on whether you have agreed or disagreed with the observations, you get to understand how that reasoning was made. Let's say I agree here, and then I move on to next. So notice from the jump section, you can always go back to a previous section. The items in red are the ones that you have disagreed previously, and the green ones are the inferences that you have agreed. And over here, you can expand to see the other observations within that inference that you have agreed or disagreed to. Out here, we can see that this inference, decision quality of young adults is not good. This itself is dependent on two different inferences that you just agreed or disagreed to. And based on this, I'm gonna put some random values. So this brings us to the overall post evaluation. So we are done with all the inferences. You can always go back and change anything. So over here, if I click here, I can go back to the inference and then I can change my agreement or disagreement. But for now, since we are done with everything and there are no cones in this argument, we can switch to the post evaluation. So post evaluation, again, as you can see, you have all the inferences over here. So the Maarg author has used these inferences. Looks like I agree with most of these inferences, which means the reasoning that has been written, I'm going to most likely agree with the reasoning itself. And therefore, the author hopes that the scores that I'm going to give on each of these factors will match what the author has done on their side. So let's say I'm gonna put some random numbers here. The second inference again has one disagreement. So based on all the reasonings, I'm gonna review and understand whether or not I agree. And then again, we can change these numbers. So now we are done with the entire reading session. We can always go back and change stuff, or we can generate a learning report. So in this learning report, first of all, we have an option to visualize the map. So for example, the first outcome, which was increase voter age to 25, we can see which inferences were linked to that. And for that inference, we can also see which observations are linked to that. So items in green indicate that we agree with those inferences. And then items these are O3 is the observation, which means I agree. You can also see items in red, which means that you disagreed. And then from these inferences, you can always get the other linked observations and inferences. One thing you may notice is the trust and context. So it looks like for this particular observation, I mistrust the source itself, but I agree with whatever has been quoted has been correctly quoted. So that's the map, the argument map out here in the evaluation. Now we have the option to again go through everything. On the inferences side, you can again revisit whatever has been previously agreed or disagreed to. And let's look at the result once more. So we can see how our opinion has changed for each outcome before and after. This time, the scores and rank looks like again, uh, the a near zero score means that I am not very certain, even after reading or before reading. A high score always indicate that the user is very sure of about that outcome, and a very negative score is also means that you absolutely do not want that outcome. So we can see after reading this Maarg, uh, as a reader, my opinion has not changed as much, except for E3 and E1, which is 16 plus with proof of responsibility and this. So this kind of means that the Maarg was not convincing enough for me, and as a writer, I need to do a better work. Over here in the learning, you can see how many views and how many have changed in favor, which means how many of these scores went in favor of the author, and then whether or not your decision went in favor. So currently, looks like the author had some different outcome in mind, which means the number one score for the author was definitely not E2. It may have been E1, E3, or E4. But overall, the author failed to convince you. You, as a reader, did not overlap before reading the Maarg, and it did not overlap after reading the Maarg. But good thing is that some changes have happened in favor of author, but again, some changes have gone against the author views. That's all about the learning report. We can always exit this, and over here you can see this was the first attempt. The draft is again kept for you locally in case you want to resume the session and then change your previous scores, and then you can always submit a new session. But in case you don't want that, you can always delete the draft and start over fresh. So this is all from the reader's perspective. Let's see how things are on the writer's perspective. I have now logged in as Maarg app, who is the author of all the previous Maargs that we discussed so far. As you can see, there are 4 Maargs that were published. There are also drafts which can be edited and republished. But let's talk about the criteria for voter eligibility. If we look at this, the Maarg author can load and read the Maarg, which we'll talk about shortly. The Maarg author can also explore the Maarg just as any other reader, and they can generate their own learning report. The Maarg author can also copy and edit to republish this Maarg. The copy and edit option is available even if you're not the original author of that Maarg. So for now, we also can see other tabs, for example, the updates. So because marks are not editable, you can always publish corrections. Marks are also public by default when you are publishing. You can always change this later on. So let's go back to the summary section, and out here you can see the stats, and the stats are not generated. So this is one thing that the Maarg authors have to do for now. This is a manual thing. They have to go to the stats tab, and then they have to generate the Maarg report manually. Before they do that, for generating a Maarg report, you need to have at least 3 unique sessions or 3 unique users who have read the Maarg. So let's do this. Stats are now updated. We move here, we can refresh. And now we can see there are 3 unique users who have read this Maarg. And so we can always generate the Maarg report each time 3 new users read and publish their reading sessions. So let us load the Maarg this time. As you can see, there is a new section called influence. And this is what the authors want to understand. What is the impact of their writing? Is it able to change any opinions or not? So to begin with, the writers can always take a look at their own responses, and then they can see what are the scores and ranks for their own responses. Remember, this data is all private. So out here we can see that E3, which is this option, this outcome, is ranked number 1 with a pretty good score of 1.67 out of this range of 3 to -3. While you can see the author's take on all the other options out here. So this kind of gives an idea of what the author's opinions are. And you can see the decision here is E3, which means the author is basically trying to convince their readers by their arguments to come up with the similar patterns as this. And if the readers, more and more readers who agree with the option E3, that means the author has done a good job overall. So that is about the author responses. These are the aggregated ranks. So remember, the ranks are scored. We have discussed while in the reader session, the ranks are basically calculated with the scores. Higher the score, better the rank is. So in this example, in this particular ranking, this option which says increase voter age to 25 looks like there was one user who had this option. Uh, for that user, this rank was 1 before they read the Maarg, and then after they read the Maarg, this went away. And similarly, number of users, how their ranks changed before and after reading the Maarg is basically kind of indicative of how the author has been able to influence not just one argument which they were shooting for, which is this one, but all the other outcomes as well. Lastly, we can see the impact on explorers. So there are different type of scores that we calculate. One is agreeability, like overall, what is the percentage of overall argument that people agree to, your readers agree to. Then there also gives you some statistics over how many users changed at least one opinion in either direction. They may go in favor of your arguments or against. Then 3 users changed one opinion in favor of your arguments. 3 users reevaluated at least one outcome, which means the overall decision or the conclusion itself. One user changed their winners, which means the ultimately the rank one outcome looks like 1 out of 3 users were able to change that. And then you can see the decision of 0 users partially match, which means 2 users, they sort of the overall rankings that 2 users have matches almost exactly what you have as a writer. So this kind of gives an overview of the influence. Based on these, the writers have a much better understanding of what to do, whether or not to change the arguments. But the granularity that we previously talked about, as you can see, without the inferences and observations, it was very difficult if these evaluations did not really have any inferences or observations. The users could not give a good feedback. But now with the inferences, we can get a good idea of how many users or how many readers agree or how many disagree with a certain inference. So it looks like two readers agree with this inference and one disagrees. And you can see these numbers out throughout. Similarly, on the observation side, we have a similar count. If the observation has a citation, we also get this information whether the source is untrusted, which means that the writer should go ahead and change. And then also if there is a misleading quote. So it looks like this particular source was all right. Let's see if we can find a second observation in which looks like 1 out of 3 users are saying that the source is untrusted. So which means that the author should go ahead and change this news source to something else. And that sort of wraps up about the observations and inferences. This feedback mechanism is again very important for the writers to sort of change their logic or their data, and then they can always go back to the design drafts, and from the draft they can always change the observations and inferences and publish a new Maarg. This is why we call our platform Maarg, because you can always take a look at these arguments. And this is basically like a map of arguments over what is your thought process behind a certain decision. So I hope this gave a good understanding of what Maarg is and how to use it. You can always search for these demo marks out here. We will keep adding more, and we hope that you can write your own marks and share it with us and with the wider community, because this is also one way for all of us to learn together and have a sort of collaborative decision making based on everyone's feedback. We understand our framework may look complex in the beginning with all the jargon like inferences and observations and the numbers and a cluttered UI. But as an early stage startup, we are fully aware of our shortcomings and we'll keep improving with time. We strongly believe that Maarg is a better alternative to most other social media channels and writing platforms, especially when it comes to debates and where we have 2 or 3 fighting sides, but we still have to make a decision and move forward. And that's what the primary goal of Maarg is. And with your feedback and support, we can hopefully evolve faster and reach that, complete that mission sooner. You can always check out the FAQs with any questions that you may have. You can also reach out to us on our social media channels so that we can answer any questions you may have. You can consider supporting us with some financially, so we can continue improving the platform, and hopefully we can bring new and more controversial debates in the future. So thank you again for your time.